When driving through Walker, Minnesota, you see this sign that says AW-GWAH-CHING. When I first saw it, I thought it was perhaps a Native American gift stop or something. I never did drive in. And thanks to videographer Tom Turney, here's the story of this tuberculosis center located in northern Minnesota and what took place and what happened over the years. AW-GWAH-CHING, the story. This sprawling complex was demolished starting in 2009 and finished in 2010. AW-GWAH-CHING, Indian name meaning out of doors.
Tuberculosis, or the Great White Plague, as it was called from 1659 to 1900, took its toll on the nation's population. In Minnesota, 1 out of every 7 deaths were due to tuberculosis. In 1867, the Minnesota legislature had created a Board of Immigration with an appropriation to print and distribute pamphlets, enticing foreigners from Norway, Sweden, Germany, England, and Ireland to settle into our great state. With the influx of this great wave of immigration, many of them suffering from consumption, the incidences of tuberculosis quickly rose. In 1904, the Minnesota legislature recommended a state sanatorium. From the Akeley Tribune, June 11, 1904, in part states, "Site for the state sanatorium. Tract of land is purchased near Leech Lake." The State Board of Control has purchased a large tract of land near Leech Lake on which the sanatorium for consumptives provided for by the last legislative will be located. The board is negotiating for more land and ultimately plans to have approximately 600 acres. The object of establishing a sanatorium in the pine woods of northern Minnesota is to provide a place where consumptives may get plenty of fresh air and healthful exercise. Experts on tuberculosis say that the so-called fresh air treatment is most effective of all treatments that have been discovered. As mentioned in the Akeley Tribune, the site was chosen to provide patients with plenty of fresh air. The 3 main reasons were its high elevation, its own water source, and away from the general population. In the spring of 1906, farming operations started, and a farmer's cottage was erected. Dr. Walter Markley was hired as superintendent and physician in charge and arrived at the sanatorium in August of 1907. The Minnesota and International Railroad Company built the sanatorium spur, which was fully operational in 1907, making deliveries of supplies more convenient. Later, patients were dropped off and picked up here as well. The main building was the first building constructed at the sanatorium, was ready for occupancy by December of 1907, with the first 2 patients admitted on December 28th. It was believed the cure for tuberculosis was not only a lot of fresh air, but a lot of good, wholesome food as well. In July of 1908, 55 patients had been admitted. The cost of care was $1 per day. The state sanatorium was authorized as a weather station for the U.S. Weather Bureau in December of 1907. A post office was established and opened on July 14th of 1908 and was called State Sanatorium. Dr. Walter Markley resigned his position as superintendent in 1911, at which time Dr. L.B. Ollinger assumed the position and remained until Dr. George W. Beach was hired as superintendent in August of 1912. The administration building was built and began being utilized in 1912 as well, making more beds available for patients. In 1915, the service building, later known as the A building, was built. This building housed such things as the laundry, the dining room, the kitchen, the bakery, and the post office, as well as it provided 30 rooms for staff use. As previously mentioned, fresh air was thought to be an important factor in the cure of tuberculosis. Wards and porches had no heat. The only heated rooms were the center of the cottages, the bathrooms, the washrooms, and 3 small sick rooms, which were used for the advanced and terminal cases. Patients slept in open porches, summer and winter. Records indicate temperatures as low as 37 degrees below, with snow on beds during storms and high winter. In caring for patients, the nurses endured many hardships. In winter, they had to wear coats, sweaters, and mittens while making beds and caring for the patients. Dr. George W. Beach tendered his resignation in 1918 to enter the Army, at which time Dr. Pearl M. Hall became superintendent. Sand Days in 1918 by Miss Anna Anderson. When the war was being waged in Europe, I came to Minnesota State Sanatorium to wage a private battle to regain my health. Later in my stay, names were suggested for the SAN. The staff, employees, and patients voted, and AW-GWAH-CHING was a popular choice. There were several cottages on the ground to care for the overflow of patients from the main building. The children's cottages, which held about 20 kiddies, was a one-storied structure. Very often a flock of sheep gazed contentedly on the lawn, and the Holsteins were not an uncommon sight. The treatment consisted of bed rest, exercise, and regularity of hours. Examination by stethoscope and sputum tests were given once a month. X-rays were not given and no collapses of any kind. May I state that there is no implied criticism, as the treatment was the accepted standard of method for that day. The D building had only screens, and we were pretty much at the mercy of the elements. To make one's bed when the weather was 40 degrees below was a feat indeed, and all patients who did not run a temperature was expected to do so. It stands out clearly in my memory that I had 21 blankets in severely cold weather. Several were used beneath me to keep the mattress between me and the mattress, and many was used over me. Storm blankets were used over the others to ward off the snow. A fortunate few possessed sleeping suits, which had hoods, but the majority used all available garments, such as bathrobes, sweaters, and what have you, with a couple of hot water bottles and flannel caps. Even all this precaution failed to keep us in comfort at times. Meals were served in the dining room to able patients. Sputum cups were left on the shelf outside the dining room, and if one needed to use them, one left the dining room. There was a scarcity of food, and rationing was practiced everywhere during the war. Sugar was not served, and some foods were sweetened with molasses. We had a pat of butter with breakfast, and for other meals margarine was substituted. Postum was served in the morning instead of coffee. The recreational hall was much in use for church services on Sunday afternoon, movies on Friday nights, and for community gatherings, as they were called, with staff, employees, and patients taking part in them. The entertainment, music, reading, dialogue, and little plays was given mostly by the patients. One evening, we assembled at the rec hall in high hopes of listening to the radio over an amplifier. Radio was in its infancy, and our expectations were dashed due to static. All we heard was squeaks and squawks. The station identifying itself from Davenport, Iowa, was the only thing discernible. The rec hall also contained books, and twice a week for 2 hours they were available to us with an ex-patient in charge. Shopping for the SAN was done in Walker by patients who had doctor's permissions, and we were taken to town in a surrey driven by a team of driving horses. The surrey had a seat crosswise for the driver. Seats for patients ran lengthwise and held space for 8 people. The whole convenience did have a top. The roads were of dirt, and with the weather played an important part in one's comfort during the trip, for there was often dusty, rutted, or wet. The surrey also was used to carry the mail to and from the SAN. This was part of an article that had appeared in the Moccasin in March of 1939. In November of 1919, occupational therapy was introduced. Work done by patients included needlepoint, crochet and knitting done by both men and women, weaving, leather tooling, beadwork, and anything small enough to be held in the hand. Looms and weaving equipment were small so that they could be used in bed by the patients. Projects were often sold and provided some income for the patients. Before any item was sold or shipped to family members, it first had to be decontaminated by wiping down with alcohol or put under an infrared lamp. For patients who were allowed out of bed, they could do woodworking and attend such meetings as the Polaris Stamp Club, Photography Club. They could go to the rec hall to watch movies or other programs, or they could help with the publication of the Pine Knot, which was the first publication for patients of tuberculosis in the state. The first issue was in September of 1913 and continued publication until October of 1924. All mail coming to or from was addressed to State Sanatorium. Patients and staff didn't feel this was a particularly descriptive or outstanding name. In fact, it might have been in some ways considered an unpleasant name since it denoted a place where tuberculosis patients were treated. So a contest was held to change the name. AW-GWAH-CHING, a Chippewa expression meaning outdoors or outside, was chosen. The United States government legally changed the name of the post office from State Sanitarium to AW-GWAH-CHING on March 21, 1922. The greenhouse was erected in 1921 and not only provided fresh flowers and plants for the wards and dining room, but added to the beauty of the grounds by providing annuals and perennials for many of the flower beds on the premises. The infirmary building was opened in July of 1923. With the completion of this building, bed capacity was increased by 20% and provided space for the segregation of far advanced patients from newly admitted patients. The X-ray machine, laboratory, and drug room was moved to this building. The infirmary gave the institution an opportunity to branch out in the use of heliotherapy, or exposure to sunlight, and other artificial means of light therapy. The sun porches on the roof were in constant use during the winter as well as the summer. The infirmary was connected to the main building by an underground tunnel. In January of 1926, a dental office was installed, and a local dentist, Dr. E.C. Wayne from Walker, was at the sanatorium once a week. An article in the Walker Pilot, May 26 of 1927, entitled State Sanatorium, in part reads, "The hospital was open with accommodations for 65 patients housed in a single building. Today it is a village in itself, resembles most of all an immense summer resort, located as it is on a tableland shadowed by pines and overlooking Leech Lake. Gaiety prevails among the patients who stroll through the beautiful grounds, and they have reason for happiness, as day by day they are regaining their health, the greatest gift of nature. Since the hospital was started, over 4,000 patients have been discharged from the institute with arrested cases. Social life at the hospital is maintained through activities as their spacious community hall allows. Dr. P.M. Hall, who is in charge of the institution, maintains that contentment is necessary in the care of the disease and makes wide provisions that the patients are at all times provided with amusement and conditions that will promote contentment and happiness. Dr. Hall passed away in 1928, at which time Dr. Herbert A. Burns was named superintendent. The nurses' home was built in 1930 to house nursing personnel. This was the first time since opening that employees were furnished with adequate housing. In August of 1931, records indicate that there was 144 people on the payroll. RN wages were $65 a month, and they worked 30 days. In 1931, the cost of patient care was $1.40 per day for board and treatment, in addition to which there was incidental such as thermometers, gauze, etc. was made the total amount approximately $46 to $47 a month. In 1932, the C building was completed, connecting the infirmary to the main building. Due to more buildings being erected, the cottages were torn down from 1929 to 1932. The state sanatorium had a total of 881 acres of land, 77 acres in field corn, 7 of garden, 125 of meadow, 60 of pasture, and 562 of woodland. Records from 1932 indicate livestock on the farm was 58 head of pure Holstein dairy cows, 3 work horses, 4 mules, 33 heifers and calves, 228 sheep and lambs, and 87 hogs. In 1933, the sanatorium train station was torn down and patients got off and on in Walker. And in March 1st of 1933, the Northland bus line began to stop at the sanatorium, and daily service to the Twin Cities was now available. There was an extensive library, and in 1934, Rachel Rotham was hired as librarian. The patient's library grew to over 10,000 books, and a library for medical staff and employees were added. Any book or periodical would go to the employee's library for 2 weeks, and then would be transferred to the patient library. Anything the patients touched was considered contaminated, so once books or periodicals were transferred to the patient library, they could no longer be used by employees. When books were returned to the library, they would have to be decontaminated by being wiped down with alcohol or put under an infrared lamp. Library services were provided to patients confined to their beds with a bookmobile, which the maintenance department built. In 1933, Congress passed a bill with the sum of $250,000 was set aside for the extension and betterment of buildings, provided that such buildings be available for the care and treatment of the Minnesota Indians. In January of 1935, the Indian Sanatorium on Ottingham burned, and all the patients were brought across the ice on Leech Lake and housed in temporary quarters until construction was complete. The Indian building, later known as the E building, was opened 7 months later in August of 1935. With the addition of the Indian building, the bed capacity of the sanatorium reached 480. The cost of care was still $1.40 per day. During the biennium ending June 30th, 1936, the main building constructed in 1907 was remodeled under the Work Progress Administration, also known as the WPA. The wooden porches throughout its southern exposure was modernized and fireproofed. Reinforced concrete slabs were built on the porches, and terrazzo floors replaced all the wooden floors throughout. Necessary channeling and installation of conduit required for lights, signal system, and radios were also completed at this time. In 1937, the sanatorium became fully approved by the American College of Surgeons. Prior to this time, any patients requiring major surgery was transported to the University of Minnesota. As late as October 20th of 1961, a report prepared by the 1963-65 Building Commission stated, "The Minnesota State Sanatorium has again been accredited by the Joint Commissions of Accreditation of Hospitals." All produce raised on the farm continue to be utilized in the dietary department. From records taken from the annual report of 1938, we note the following produce was utilized from the farm: 75,173 pounds of potatoes, 31,835 pounds of pork, 732,840 pounds of milk, 99 pounds of radishes, and 6,821 pounds of cabbages. The dietary department reported the same year that 7 barrels of sauerkraut were made and 165 gallons of bread and butter pickles were put up. In April of 1938, the first issue of the Moccasin was organized and published. This published news about patients and news from around the sanatorium, as well as news from other sanatoriums. It was printed in booklet from 1938 until 1948 and sold for 5 cents per copy or 50 cents per year. In June of 1940, an article by Corinne Anderson called "Education by San School" in part reads, "We have heard of obtaining an education in various kinds of school, among them the School of Experience, the School of Hard Knocks, the School of Life, the elementary school, the secondary school, the School of Agricultural Mind and whatnot, and even the School of Scandal. But a relatively new type in sanatoriums is a sanatorium school. Being now in its 4th year, this school is just out of its infantile stage. Every school, even colleges, has had to pass through its early growing stages. Each year there has been an average enrollment of about 50 students in the sanatorium school. About 40 of these finish the year completely, the others dropping out because of illness, transfer, or other legitimate reasons. Many students, by Herculean effort, have worked their way to the top and obtained high school diplomas from their own home schools because of the work that they have done here. This year, in the senior high, there are 4 graduates. Last year, there were 4. And each year, there have been 10 or 12 junior high school students. In the 1940s, the records indicate the farm produce was delivered to the dietary department consisting of 1,193 bushels of potatoes, 3,443 pounds of cabbage, 3,960 pounds of squash, 60 bushels of carrots, 66 bushels of beets, 53 bushels of rutabagas, and 56 bushels of onions. 840 pounds of parsnips was used, and 641 pounds of turnips. The sanatorium's function became more and more that of a hospital, prepared to perform any and all medical services, regardless of complaints, disease, complications, or surgical procedure. More than 705 of all admissions in 1941 were advanced cases of tuberculosis calling for chest surgeries of some kind. The state sanatorium was equipped to handle all forms of chest surgery and did so. Questions and comments have often arisen that some patients admitted to the sanatorium did not in fact have tuberculosis. And the response to that is yes, that is quite likely. But you have to keep in mind a couple of factors. 1 out of every 7 deaths in Minnesota was caused from tuberculosis. And with tuberculosis being a communicable disease, They had to err on the caution whenever in question. Upon Dr. Burns' resignation in 1942, Dr. F. Callahan was named as his replacement. A classroom was built and furnished on the 5th floor of the Indian Building, and all students began taking their classes there instead of in bed. The new antibiotic agent, streptomycin, was introduced in April of 1947. The first tubercular patient to receive the antibiotic made a complete recovery. Other drugs such as PAS and INH became available for general use in 1949. In November of 1950, the census was 300, this being the first decrease that was seen by the state sanatorium since being open. Dr. Callahan resigned his position as superintendent in 1946 to enter private practice in St. Paul. And Dr. Crow assumed the position of superintendent until 1952, at which time he resigned and Dr. M. Williams was appointed to the position. Because of the changing health laws and cost effectiveness, the farming operation was discontinued in 1953. In February of 1956, the Department of Welfare, acting on the advice of the Legislation Study Commission on Welfare, arranged a trial program for the admission of 30 senile, mentally deteriorated tubercular women to be admitted. And in August, an additional 30 senile, mentally deteriorated tubercular men were admitted. During 1958, the pilot study program to utilize empty beds became law. 43% of the sanatorium beds were occupied by committed senile patients, of which 1/3 had tuberculosis. By 1960, 55% of the total bed capacity was utilized by committed senile patients. The sanatorium, by directive of the Department of Public Welfare, was banned from admitting any new tubercular patients after August 31st of 1961. Speaking before the legislature in 1961, Dr. M. Williams stated, "We have lifted the fear. Nobody's afraid of tuberculosis anymore. But never will we outtreat and extinguish tuberculosis. We have improved our position, but the enemy is still there." All tuberculosis patients were transferred on or before January 2nd of 1962 to the Glen Lake Sanatorium in Minnetonka. Until it closed on January 1st of 1962, the complex continued to serve as the only state-owned facility operated solely for the treatment of tuberculosis. After treating nearly 14,000 patients over a period of 55 years in the battle to thwart tuberculosis, the Minnesota State Sanatorium for Consumptives, the facility closed on January 1st, 1962. The complex was converted into a state nursing home for geriatric patients known as the AW-GWAH-CHING Nursing Home.
Yes, I'm John Grimley, and I was retired as a CEO at AW-GWAH-CHING in 1990, but I started there in 1975 as the assistant administrator and then became the CEO at a later date. Good job, Karen, on the history of the SAN. In January 1962, the legislature changed the name to AW-GWAH-CHING Nursing Home. And that was after the last TB patients were gone, and switched the emphasis to other residents. Then what happened then was they brought in busloads of what they termed burned out mental patients from throughout the other state hospitals in Minnesota. And they came from all over, and it wasn't long before the capacity was up to 462, and they had 348 employees. In 1975, Dr. Williams retired as the last physician, full-time physician for AW-GWAH-CHING. After that, there were contracts written with first the Park Rapids Clinic and then the Bemidji Clinic. and they took turns coming down certain days to see residents, and so there was no full-time or full-time physician. And then a number of other things happened around that time. All units were locked up until 1975, and they began unlocking those units. So when they were done, there were only about 2 units that were locked. And also, when unlocking the units, they added some day rooms and recreation rooms to some of the buildings so that the residents would have a place to go and do some things. Also, with no full-time physician, there were 2 nurse practitioners added. They had a very, very tight protocol of what they could do in the absence of the doctors. What they could do a whole lot of things, and they would be in constant contact with the doctor if some condition would come up that they didn't know how to handle. And that just worked out very well, and in fact that same method of handling residents without doctors was picked up by other state hospitals and other nursing homes in the state system. And then right shortly after that, there were added 2 clinical psychologists. They were Doctors Katie and Jean Bradfield. And that was a good addition because that let the employees know how to handle these hard to care for patients. And Dr. Jean Bradfield was blind, but he sat on every care plan for all the residents, and he gave his input. He knew where they were living, and he knew their problems, and it was fun to watch him work when he was at a care plan, because he really got involved in trying to do the best for each of the residents. There were additional services added in 1977, well, 77 to 85. A staff development person was added. Pam Sipes became the staff development person to train staff, and the personnel department was started, and Irma Chantal was a new personnel director. Also along that time, there was a volunteer council started, because we were having the Red Cross ladies be volunteers at AW-GWAH-CHING, but they could only come 1 day a week, and there weren't that many of them, and they couldn't possibly do all the volunteer type things that would be required. So with the addition of the volunteer council, we just had many I would estimate we probably were up to 50 or 60 volunteers from the community that would come in and do volunteer work for us. And that was a real godsend to the employees. Also in 1981, we experienced the state employee strike which lasted for 21 days. That strike brought out the best and the worst in people. It was unbelievable, some things that did or didn't happen, and as a result we had to go to the community and ask for volunteers to come in and take care of the residents, because all the other staff was out on strike. And so we put out calls, and we had people volunteering from all towns around Walker, and what would happen is someone would drive through the strike line, but some didn't want to drive through the strike line because they're concerned about what would happen to their vehicle. So I would meet them at the school bus garage out on 34 in the morning at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I would have a load come in, and we would bring them in through the strike line then and up to the administration building. And some interesting things were happening. I can still recall coming to those strike lines and being yelled not really nice names at us, and the scabs that they said we were carrying in the vehicle. And but then the other thing that was going on too is we then started to have some Midwest patrol people on duty, because we needed them to sort of make sure that too many shenanigans weren't pulled, because there were lots of cases of people's tires were being slashed in a parking lot if they drove in there, and some windows broken and things like that. And that was unfortunate, but I think when it was all over and the residents were taken care of, and it was a good lesson for both the employees and the people who went on strike, and they all came back, and things got back to normal quite rapidly. The next big event that occurred was many federal legislative actions regarding deinstitutionalizing residents, and there were many different laws that were put on the books after provide a treatment for people with alcohol or other abuses, and it just started in 1982. Very rapidly, we got a call from Commissioner Levine, and he said, "You're going to start a treatment center at AW-GWAH-CHING." Now, within I think about a week, it was up and running, and it ran until 2000. And at that time, the residents who were there were transferred to Brainerd, where they also had a unit like that there too. So it was a good experience for the campus. And in 2000, the state said, "Look, we got to take a look at this facility and see what's going to happen." So they appointed a reuse committee in 2000. I was on that committee, and there were a number of architectural firms, about 3 I think, that made up did a study on what could possibly be utilized in these buildings at that site. And none of them came up with anything, but long story short, and no reuses were found. So then, of course, the next thing that happened was the state said, well, if we can't use it for something, and the state entered into a program of demolishing unused buildings. And they said, well, okay, we will demolish AW-GWAH-CHING. And they set aside $5 million to Cass County to have the buildings demolished, and then the property would become would be deeded over to Cass County, except for the part along the lake shore, and the Department of Natural Resources got that part to do something down the road. But it wasn't an easy task to demolish those kinds of buildings, because some of those buildings had walls that were at least 18 inches thick of solid concrete. So as they started demolishing them, they did decide that on the solid concrete pieces they busted out of there, they would take they dug holes out in the old farm area and buried them, because there was no pollution in them or anything. But the other thing they found was there were tunnels all over for the steam lines to run from one building to another on the campus. And wouldn't you know, all of those steam pipes were wrapped with asbestos. So we had the biggest asbestos debatement I think the state has ever undertaken, because also all the steam lines from building to building inside was also wrapped with asbestos to keep the heat in them. So that was a big operation in itself. And then they had to dig out all these tunnels and then fill them back up, and it was they worked for approximately a year to finally demolish them all. And the only thing that wasn't demolished was that little gazebo on the site, which took care of the weather conditions at AW-GWAH-CHING. It was a weather bureau, weather station from 1907 till it was closed in 2000. And later on, it was moved to the powerhouse, where they took the temperature there instead of walking over to that little gazebo. So that was quite an undertaking. And then from there they put on put black dirt and grass, and it's all grass out there now, and whenever I drive by it, I just think to myself, what a shame that those sturdy buildings had to be demolished, but that's the way it goes sometimes. So, in ending, I just hope that someday something will be able to happen on that property, and I'm sure it will. The county, I know, is interested in putting a courthouse there. A couple other units of government are interested in relocating out there. So we'll just have to wait and see. So thank you very much.
That was used for measuring ingredients that were used in the treatment of patients. Scales today are not much different than this one, actually. So even though this one is very, very old, it probably is not all that dated because they haven't changed that much. Surgeons' gloves were all made of rubber and were re-autoclaved and reused. Again, all of the equipment was glass, beakers for measuring, all were glass, had to be re-sterilized. So keeping equipment up to usable condition was a very labor-intensive process. Some of the needles that were used in the care of TB patients and other patients as well are very, very long. And they're long and of various size and shapes and diameters is because the length was needed for reach into an internal cavity. These were not injected in their entirety into the patient. They were used to reach an internal area of the body. So even though they look long, a whole lot of that needle is not injected by any means. This is an old mask that was used for anesthesia and an old rubber ventilating bag that is also used to ventilate the patient during surgery. This is a very, very early blood pressure cuff, and mercury was the means by which it told the nurse or the operator of the apparatus what the blood pressure was on that patient. The cuff was wrapped around the arm, and then the bulb was squeezed until the mercury went up to a certain height, and then the pressure was released so that the mercury would begin to come down in the apparatus, and the nurse then would hear the top systolic number. And as it continued to come down, the beat of the blood against the artery walls would diminish until the nurse could no longer hear that beat. And that was the lower number then of the blood pressure. Okay, I would like to move on to some more equipment that we haven't talked about until now. And that is orthopedic equipment that was used to treat tuberculosis. And one of them, first of all, is what is called a rib cutter. What they would do in the treatment of TB would be to remove a rib that would take the pressure off of the surface of the lung tissue. That was the theory behind the removal of the rib. And this apparatus is a rib cutter. This is a retractor that is used in surgery to pull the tissue aside for the surgeon. It's most often used by nurses that are assisting in the operative procedure and is used just to aid in the visualization of the area that the surgeon is working in. This is a bone saw that is used in the removal of a bone or a dissection of a small piece of bone. And we have mentioned that TB of the bone was being treated at AW-GWAH-CHING, and I'm sure this type of saw was used in the removal of bone. This is a bone drill that was mechanically used, and the drill bit would fit on this end of the drill, and everything was manually done during surgery for the orthopedic removal of diseased tissue, bony tissue. This is a cast cutter to remove casts. After a piece of bone was removed, a cast would be applied to the extremity or the arm or leg, and then when it was time to remove that cast, this cutter was used to cut the cast itself in order to remove it. This was called a rib spreader, whereby the ribs were spread apart during a surgical procedure to remove part of a lung that was damaged badly by the TB infection. Of course, this was before the advent of antibiotics that were being used to treat TB in the mid-40s. The nurses wore caps, especially the head nurses wore caps that looked very much like this. All of the masks that were used were made of cloth. They were laundered and reused again. This is an enamel urinal that was used years ago for the male patient who needed to urinate in bed, and they were called ducts. All the patients were quarantined at AW-GWAH-CHING and kept there during the whole time that they were under treatment for their disease process.
My sister had a very bad cough and cold, and finally it came to the point where she spit up blood. So my father took her to the doctor, and they put her right in the hospital and did tests and found out that she had tuberculosis. So they had to treat her, and they sent her to AW-GWAH-CHING to try to get her over this tuberculosis. She was there for some time before it didn't seem like anything was working good and nothing positive was happening to get her over this. So my dad decided to put her in hospital in Minneapolis, and it was specialized in treating tuberculosis patients. And when she went there, they did surgery and removed the portion of her lungs that were affected by the tuberculosis. And then she was better. And I, in the meantime, was sent to AW-GWAH-CHING along with my sister that we could have some preventative shots so that we would not get tuberculosis. So every day for 3 months, they gave us 4 shots a day to prevent us getting tuberculosis. And it was very uncomfortable, and it wasn't fun a bit to have to go through all that. But at the end of that time, they had not found anything bad in our lungs or anything. So my father thought, well, this is it. You know, what good is this? So he took us out of AW-GWAH-CHING and took us home. While we were there, they even did an oil x-ray, they called it, on me, where they dripped warm oil into my lungs. And I went through about a week of just choking, kind of choking and spitting up stuff, and it was just miserable. But nothing else came of it, so that was shortly before my dad took us out because he was concerned about what was going to happen to us. I've been fine since.
My name is Kenneth Berg. I'm in assisted living now at Thief River Falls, but I was in the tuberculosis sanatorium in Walker. I went in
December of '49.
December of '49. My wife and me had just been married about
Year and a half.
year and a half. We were married on Valentine's Day. So I spent better than 2 years in a sanatorium, sleeping on a mattress that was about 4 inches thick, a cotton mattress. I guess the state couldn't afford to buy anything better. That mattress was too short. I had a wedge-ectomy, they called it those days. I was very, very painful. A wedge-ectomy was a new type of surgery which a doctor by the name of Dr. Cancello had perfected. And he took a right lobe of my lung and took a wedge out of it. That's what they were calling it, a wedgectomy, to recuperate. But I spent 2 years in AW-GWAH-CHING. My doctor was Dr. Williams, and Dr. Crow was administrator at the time. But Williams was my primary doctor. But the TB, they didn't have any real cure for TB at the time until they got this streptomycin. They would take us down, and they were trying to kind of soften the pressure on your lungs, so they would take us down on a gurney and put air in the diaphragm between your diaphragm and the lung. And I remember I used to always hate that because you felt like you were blowed up. You know, they put all that air in you. It would be about every 3 days that they put in this air, because then by that time it would leak out and you'd start to feel decent again. But in the meantime, it was miserable. And then I had a phrenic nerve cut, or it was not cut, it was shocked, and it was supposed to stop after I had surgery on his right lung. This phrenic nerve controls your diaphragm, and it in turn was supposed to slow down and allow this lung to heal. But the first time they did it, it didn't work. So after some time, and they saw it didn't work, they did it again, and then they hit it too hard, so it never started again. So I have been pretty much on one lung. Well, I was in bed constantly for all the time that I was in Walker, in AW-GWAH-CHING. And I never went to the toilet for the full time. It was about 2 years. I was laid horizontal, and they would come in with the gurney and roll you over, take you down, and put this air in you, bring you back, and lay you down. And I had a table with a little table that I ate on that had a little peg that held my plate, you know, a little, just a little small table, maybe it was 12 by 12. Set the plate in that, and then you'd eat kind of with your head, your neck down. but I don't know, I got into occupational therapy, I started knitting. And I knit gloves by the box full,
Sweaters.
give them away. I even sold them.
Nights of
Oh
fruit.
yeah, well I got a coffee can from the janitor, and I put it on my radiator, because I had the radiator right beside my bed, and I could reach that. And then when the drinking water that I didn't drink, that they would give you during the day, I'd put it in this little thing to make kind of a humidifier for myself. And when the nurse come in the evening, opened the window and threw more blankets on you, it got so cold in there that my water thing, the bottom of it got round, you know. They'd turn the radiator off at night. It was so cold there was frost on the bedspread. In the morning, you could see some white frost on there. Okay. When I left the sanatorium, or way before I left the sanatorium, after we got streptomycin and PAS, my GWAH count went down, so I was not contagious anymore. So I could go out amongst the public. But I think the law is still today, if you were contagious, you're not to mingle with the public. And I didn't want to go back, and I said I'd get up and run. And they said, well, we'll catch you and put you back in jail, or put you back
in the sand.
put you back in the sand.
I'm Lois Kirkmo Murphy, and I am a former patient at AW-GWAH-CHING Hospital. When I was 14 years old, 1947, I found out that I had a positive mantle, and this was due to the fact that my sister developed TB, and she had a hemorrhage, so that we were exposed to TB. And shortly after that, I entered AW-GWAH-CHING Hospital, and I was there for 5 years, and so when I was 19, I was able to go home, but it was against the doctor's wishes. I had many treatments while I was there. I had 2 surgeries, phrenectomies, to collapse my my lungs by pinching the phrenic nerve. And I also had pneumoperitoneum, which was given to me on, I think it was a weekly basis. And they would insert air into the abdomen or below the lungs. I'm not sure how it worked. And it would collapse that part of the lung. And I had that for a long time. I had 2 different kinds of medications. One was called PAS, and they were pills, large pills that I took, and I took a long series of those. And then I also had streptomycin, and I think those were the only treatments I had. But periodically they would do tests where they would put a tube down into our stomachs, and they would test the fluid, and they would see whether we had any germs, or TB germs in it, I guess. And that was a very uncomfortable test that they did. And of course we had numerous x-rays and fluoroscopes. Every week when I would have my pneumo treatments, they would do a fluoroscope before, so we got a lot of fluoroscope done. And being 14, I hadn't done my high school work, and so they had a teacher there who would go to the bed, and she would teach us, and she was very helpful. And I took my entire high school education there, and I took state boards, and that's how I graduated. So I never had a graduation. My parents lived 50 miles away from the hospital, so we didn't see them very often because they had a farm and they couldn't get away that often. And I had a sister that was ill at home, so they couldn't leave her too much. So we saw them just on occasion. 1952 that I was up and about, and I thought I was ready to go home, and they did an x-ray on me and they said that I had a new spot. They contacted my parents and told them that they wanted them to come in and talk to them, and they did. And the doctors told them that I had a new spot and that they would need to remove one of my lobes. And my father was very unhappy to hear that, and he told them that he was not going to allow that to happen and that he was taking me home. And so he signed papers for me to leave against their wishes. He took me home, and shortly after they took me to their doctor, and he had x-rays done, and he sent them to a specialist at Duluth University, and the specialist reviewed them, and he contacted the doctor and told him that according to the x-rays, he doesn't think that I ever had TB, and that he couldn't see any sign of it anyway. My parents, of course, were relieved and happy, but I was more happy than anybody because except it's pretty hard to think that you spent all those years, you know, in bed, because about 4 years of that, it was complete bed rest. We couldn't even get up. So it was definitely not easy. It was quite an unhappy experience, but it was wonderful to find out that everything was okay and I didn't have to worry about going back anyway. Yeah, well, actually, when my dad wanted to take me home, I cried because I was so afraid that they were going to send somebody to get me, you know, and take me back, because I had a friend at the sanatorium who ran away, and they'd put him in jail there at the sanatorium. And I was so afraid that that was going to happen to me, and so when I begged my dad not to do it, and he said, I'm taking you. And so he did, and I'm so grateful that he did. But I did live in fear. One Sunday I went to church, and one of the doctors happened to be at our church that Sunday. And I panicked when I saw him. I tried to keep out of way so he wouldn't see me, because I didn't want, you know, for him to tell me I had to go back or something. But it wasn't too long after that that I was able to live a normal life and not have to worry. So, you know, when I went home, it was the very first time I had been out of the hospital for the 5 years. So I haven't had any health problems as far as the, you know, TB is concerned. I have x-rays regularly. I have ever since I've left the hospital, and never have they even mentioned that they see any sort of spot or anything, so everything's fine.
This postal card, dated March 1950, was to be sent to Lois Kirkemo by her friend Elaine, who had been transferred to Glen Lake Sanatorium for surgery. The card reads as follows. Dear friends, this card is started before my surgery, and I hope to get someone to finish it for me to let you know how I am. If everything goes okay, I'll try to write you a letter later. The card was never finished by Elaine, but her mother finished it for her and added these following words.
I'll finish Elaine's card, and sorry to say she didn't come out after surgery. Let's think of her memory of good works done for others. God bless, Mrs. Carl Reed.
I'm Alma Torgeson Turney. In 1949, I was attending Bemidji State Teachers College in northern Minnesota. I had what I thought was a bad cold because I had pressure in my chest. And I went to the school nurse. She ordered an x-ray and told me to come back the next day for a report on that x-ray, which I did. And she then told me that the biology professor had read the x-ray and that I had tuberculosis, TB, and I had to leave the school immediately. They had contacted my father to come and get me, take me out of the school, and they also made arrangements for me to enter AW-GWAH-CHING State TB Sanatorium, which is near Walker, Minnesota. 3 days later, I entered the sanitarium. I'll never forget that day. I had been a very active student, participating in sports. I had been very active on my dad's farm, helping him. And I'd also had to take over all the household duties for my mother as she had passed away. And all of a sudden, I was put into a wheelchair and wheeled away. From the wheelchair, I was put on a gurney, and from the gurney, I was put into bed and ordered strict bed rest, meaning I was not to leave the bed. If I left the bed, it was by gurney for the first few months, and later on, several months later, I went by wheelchair to wherever they were going to take me. It was a completely new and it was a hard experience. There was no privacy there whatsoever, none. I also found out that there were no privileges. There were no telephones. We did have a radio, and we could listen to that radio. We had a choice of 3 different stations. Everything had to be done by permission, and I had to obtain permission from the doctor so that I could learn how to knit. And I did learn how to knit, so that's what I did. I knitted and I read a great deal. I was taken on a gurney to a surgical room, and my hips and legs were placed on a table, my shoulders on another table, and my body was arced downward on my left side. And the doctor inserted a needle between a couple of ribs, and with a type of suction, he was able to withdraw, to drain 2,000 cc's of fluid from my lung area. I was on the table and in that position for 2 hours. I was told not to move because the needle could puncture my lung. I passed out from fatigue, from lying there that long, and then they stopped. I did hear the nurse say to the doctor, "Where is it all coming from?" Meaning the fluid. I found out later that 2,000 cc's of fluid was a great amount of fluid to be taken from that area. The doctor, for his report, and he told me that under the fluid there was TB, and in fact he pointed it out to me on the X-ray. And I remember very timidly asking him, I was so afraid. I timidly asked him, "How long do you think I'll be here?" Because I had heard the stories from the girls around me. Some had been there 2 years, some 3 years. And I had a fear. And his answer to me was, "You'll be here 1 to 2 years if you make it." I'm sure I returned to my bed in shock. And I know at night I would hear weeping and crying for those patients around me. And I joined them. No wonder there was a lot of crying at night. That first year I was on strict bed rest. The second year I was allowed to get up, I was moved to another building. And how wonderful that was, because I was able to walk. To this day, I so often will say I'm so thankful for the ability to walk, for the freedom of walking. Well, when I had been there 2 years, my 21st birthday was coming up. And I was up and walking to the dining room, going to the bathroom, sewing by hand, and even washing some clothes by hand and ironing and such. And I thought, well, I can do this at home. And I went to the charge nurse, who was taking care of about 20 of us in one room, and told her that I had contacted my father by mail and that he would be there to pick me up on June 22nd at 10 in the morning. He arrived at 8 in the morning, but at 10 in the morning, I signed a form that she provided for me, unauthorized leave, and I gladly signed it. And then she pointed her finger at me and she said, "And you will be dead in 6 months." Well, my thought by then was, if I'm dead in 6 months, I'd rather die at home than die here. And I was taken home by my dad, and it was the happiest day of my life, because I was going home to the farm, to my dad, to my little sister. And I still vividly remember that ride home with Dad in his 1936 Ford, and how happy he was to take me home again. One of the very first people I met when I entered the San was Lois Kirkemo. She was in a bed about 4 feet from mine. Marjorie was about 4 feet on the other side. Another Lois and Doris were back about 4 feet. Lois was a beautiful young girl, about 15. I think she'd been there about 3 years then. And we have kept in touch over the years. And we are going to reminisce now about some of those things that happened when we were in the San. Doctors did a lot of experimenting at that sanatorium. And I was one of those that they experimented upon. Again, I was taken to the surgical area. And again, I was placed on a table with my head dropped over the end of that table so that the doctor could insert a steel, unflexible rod into my mouth and into the upper part of my chest area. And I was told that there was a light at the end of that rod so that the doctor could see where the TB was. And whenever they did a surgical procedure, the patient was always naked to the waist. They didn't do any, as I said, there was no privacy. I lay there with my head over the end of the table. The rod was inserted. And I suppose he looked around. But then when he was going to take the rod out again, my throat area had become swollen, and he could not get that steel rod out. And I remember lying there, and as he was tugging on the rod, I became frightened because I thought, what's he going to do? He can't get this thing out. And then he finally told the nurse, he said, lay on her. And the nurse lay over me and put both hands on my shoulders and held my shoulders down. And he pulled the rod out. There was some damage in my throat, and I had difficulty speaking. for quite a while afterward. But that was one of the experiments that was done on me. They never did tell me if they found anything down there or not. But there were good times that we had too. When we were given permission, we could go see a movie. I believe there was a movie once a month, the black and white movies of the 1940s. There was a Christmas party that they gave for us. We arrived in our wheelchairs and watched the Christmas party. The food was abundant and excellently prepared. In fact, there was a bottle of milk on my tray every day, raw milk, with an inch of cream on the top. I was supposed to drink it. I didn't really care for milk. We got our hair washed once a month, and that was a joy, to get our hair washed. Of course, we didn't use the sprays and such as they have now, but it was wonderful to get our hair washed. Pastors, ministers, and priests came often to see us, visited with us. And even if we weren't of their particular congregation, we were close enough so that could overhear the prayers, the conversations, the encouragements that the pastors and ministers and the priests gave to their people. They were a joy whenever they came and an encouragement to us when they came. One of the most sad parts of being there was to see young mothers who had to leave their children in the care of relatives or someone else, and they had to enter the sanatorium. And my friend Doris had been in the san 2 years, and she got to see her children and got to go close to her children, and they didn't know her, and they didn't want anything to do with her. And this was heartbreaking for Doris. After I left the san, I returned to school to complete my education. And this time I returned to school in Minneapolis. I thought that I should have a follow-up x-ray because it had been about 6 months or so since I'd had my last x-ray at the san. And this time I went to a specialist, had an x-ray, and got the report. And I was shocked when I got the report because I can quote it word for word what the doctor said to me. The report of my x-ray showed, quote, "It's very probable that you never had TB," end of quote. I could hardly believe it. About a year later, I decided I should have another chest x-ray and get another opinion. And the report was from a different doctor, a different clinic, but the report was exactly the same words as I had received from the first doctor. The x-rays now were trained, of course. And they told me that we believe that the fluid that was drained from your lung area was pleurisy fluid. But there doesn't seem to have been any TB beneath the pleurisy. I often think, what if I did not have the courage to say, I'm leaving, and I signed the unauthorized form, and I walked out. And my dear dad took me home. Where would I be today? Lois and I are reminiscing about the days we spent in the sanatorium. The very first patient I met there was Lois. She was in the next bed to me, about 4 feet over. Our beds were close together, and there was no privacy for anyone. We were all treated alike. I had the strict bed rest, and Lois had strict bed rest, and Marjorie the same way. In back of Lois was another Lois. We were all very much in the same boat. Lois was young. She was a young girl. She was, what were you, Lois? You were about 14 when you arrived, and When I met you, you had been there 3 years? 2 years?
I went in 47, so
I came in 49, so you had been
2
there 2
years,
years then. And she, young, beautiful girl, alone. Her parents would come occasionally to visit her. And she became my friend, and we've kept in touch over the years. And now I'm 80, You're in your-
76.
76. And we're remembering the time when we were in the sanatorium, and some of the we refer to them as girls. Some of the girls that were our roommates when we were there. But Lois, remember the time at Easter when we all made Easter bonnets?
Oh, I sure do.
Yes.
That was a fun
Where did we get our
experience.
materials to make the Easter bonnets?
I'm not really sure. I guess just things that we found around there because we couldn't get up and go any place. We were just bedridden, so I don't know how we got all this stuff.
We were bedridden, but we left our beds to sit on Lois's bed and have our picture taken. We weren't supposed to do that either.
No.
No, that was a no-no. And then we had this one too. This was 4 other girls who were close by. We had a good time that time making our. You really have a fancy bonnet on there.
It's just cardboard with some kind of paper glued on, I think.
Sure.
But
Well, mine is made out of crepe paper. After our lunch, that we were told we had to put everything aside and sleep for 2 hours. That was called what, Arthur?
rest hour, wasn't
Rest
it?
hour.
I think it was rest hour.
I think it was 2 hours, or rest hour, or something. And somebody there had a Monopoly game. and we, during that rest hour, the doors were all closed and we're supposed to be in bed sleeping, but there's a Monopoly game going on somebody's bed somewhere. And I know one time we got caught. I think we were on Lois's bed, back of you. I don't know if you were involved.
Oh
but
yeah,
know
I
was.
loved Monopoly. I was
I know.
addicted to it.
I was involved, and wouldn't you know, Dr. Kinsella opened the door and walked in. And Lois was so angry. She said, "It's your fault, Alma." It seemed to me that during the years that I was right in the next bed to you, that you spent a lot of time studying, because the teacher would come, I believe, once a day for 5 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And Lois was a bright, intelligent kid. And I remember was studying so hard for her exams. And we were
State
both
board.
nervous about her passing it, and she passed it with no problem. I remember the
thank
teacher
goodness.
coming, giving a report. What?
I thank goodness.
Oh, yes. And I spent my time reading, and then we could listen to the radio. Now, what stations did we have on the radio?
I don't remember the station, but I remember listening to Arthur Godfrey all the time.
I remember Arthur Godfrey. He was a favorite.
Yeah.
Lois, do you remember the stomach washings that we got every 3 months for 3 days in a row before we ever had any breakfast in those mornings?
Very definitely. It was one of the worst experiences of my whole stay.
I agree.
They would take a plastic tube and they would put it in oil, and then they would start pushing it down your throat, and they just keep pushing and pushing and say swallow, 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 and of course it's the normal reaction to gag, you know, but we would just keep, you know, we had no choice. They just keep pushing it down. One time they pushed it down so far it started coming back up on me. It must have done a curve and came back up. But
Oh.
anyway, then they would withdraw fluid and they would test it. But I decided I was going to make it a little less painful, so I determined that I was going to, every time they would say swallow, I would try to think it was something good going down. And so I got so that I could swallow it quite painlessly, and everybody called me the sword swallower. Because I was one of the few, I guess, that would swallow it without too much complaint. But it was
I wonder
awful.
why, you know, we drank that little bit of water or oil or whatever it was first, and
Yeah.
that's what they pumped up out of us again. And I'm wondering why they would test that area in our stomach when our TB is over in
I
our
know.
lungs.
I wondered that too.
Yeah, I don't know why.
But
But we
it-
had to endure it. It was awful.
And it was not a soft tube. It was very, very brittle.
No, and everybody had to do it.
It wasn't pleasant.
It was not pleasant, no. I've had a good 58 years since I was there. Met my husband and married him, and have had many chest x-rays and such, and no one has ever commented to me that there's a past history of TB.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't see it. And I feel really, for my age right now, I'm in really good health.
Yeah, I feel the same way about me. I've been very fortunate. And both my sisters too, you know, all three of us have lived long lives and our health hasn't been that bad, so.
We're very thankful, aren't we? This is a single private room, which was right next door to where my bed was located here in the sanatorium. And this room was used for patients who were dying. They were brought in here a few days before they passed away, and they had the private room. This partition is where my bed stood, and I was confined to that bed for 9 months. I was allowed to get out of bed while they made the bed, and then had to get back in again. After 9 months, I was given a privilege, and that was a 5-minute privilege to be up to go to the bathroom. And believe me, a 5-minute privilege a day was a wonderful privilege, but it was part of the discipline that we were subject to. Over here was Lois's bed, and in here were 2 more beds. Here are 2 more beds. Margie's bed was there, 2 more beds. And there was no privacy at all. We didn't have curtains, even for privacy. In our tour of AW-GWAH-CHING, before its demolition, we saw these beautiful designs in the terrazzo floors. This Leech Lake scene has a red dot at the 6 o'clock position to indicate Walker, Minnesota. These hand-painted wall murals were done in Native American design. This is a hand-painted picture of the 1907 AW-GWAH-CHING Railroad Station Depot and locomotive.
This was the official weather station for AW-GWAH-CHING from 1907 to the closing in 2000. But for about the last few years, it was moved up near the old powerhouse, and the instruments were up there so they could read them more easily than coming over here to read them.